Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working? Fantastic. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Department of Politics and Governance of the University of Nicosia, the Institute for Interdisciplinary Cypriot Studies, and the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation to this conference entitled When the Cemetery Becomes Politically, dealing with the religious heritage in Cyprus and its neighboring countries. I'm telling you now, you're in for a treat. I'll tell you more in a second, but now I close for the time being and open the floor to the head of our department, Ayia Sophia, for his opening remarks. I'm ready.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear participants, good morning everybody. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this conference, which is organized, as already noted, by the Institute for Interdisciplinary Cypriot Studies at the University of Nicosia in cooperation with the Department of Politics and Governance of the University of Nicosia and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Foundation Cyprus office. It is essential to understand that this particular conference takes place within the framework of a particular political context. Indeed, the excesses that have taken place over time were the outcome of particular political agendas which did not focus on mutually acceptable objectives. On the contrary, excesses took place when objectives were mutually exclusive. It is also important to distinguish between the endogenous and the exogenous causes of conflicts. This conference, which is entitled When the Cemetery Becomes Political, dealing with the religious heritage in Cyprus and its neighboring countries, focuses, among other things, as it indicates, on the complex and complicated interaction between religion and politics. In the case of Cyprus, the religious dimension was not a major aspect of the conflict. Nevertheless, with the paradigm shift that has taken place in Turkey, the occupied northern part of Cyprus has also been affected. For example, there are more and more mosques in the occupied northern part of Cyprus today than ever before. And given the major demographic changes taking place as an outcome of colonization from Anatolia, political trends are certainly influenced. Given these developments, not surprisingly, the relationship between politics, society, and religion becomes stronger and stronger in the northern part of Cyprus. At this historical juncture, it is difficult to predict future developments. Be that as it may, if we compare Cyprus with developments in the broader area, especially in the Middle East, it is obvious that there are still substantial differences. In the Middle East, it is extremely difficult, I would say practically impossible, to differentiate religion from politics and society. One of the questions that may be raised is whether these circumstances can be reversed and indeed be improved. I recall that in 1993 or 1994, the then President of the Republic of Cyprus, apologized to the Turkish Cypriots for the pain caused, despite the fact that the dominant perception among Greek Cypriots is that the crimes of Turkey and the Turkish side in general weigh much more on the scale than their own mistakes and excesses. To the present day, there has not been any reciprocal statement either from the Turkish Cypriot leadership or Turkey. In the Greek Cypriot community, there has been a strong conviction that reconciliation is essential within the framework of a balanced and honorable compromise. Nevertheless, such an outcome is not in sight, and the philosophy of the rejected Annan plan and similar ones is perceived as detrimental. The mainstream perception in the Greek Cypriot community on that is that these plans, if implemented, will legitimize the outcome of the 1974 events, and furthermore, they will worsen the status quo for the Greek Cypriots. On the other hand, a constructive breakthrough in Cyprus, in a way that a viable and functional federal solution is achieved, will not only improve the everyday life of all Cypriots, but will also serve broader objectives. Let me take this opportunity to stress that repeatedly it has been argued that the settlement in Cyprus, which encourages the peaceful coexistence of Greek Cypriot Christians and Turkish Cypriot Muslims, will have multidimensional positive implications beyond the territorial frontiers of this island state. Such a scenario, though, at this stage does not seem to be a possible outcome, at least in the short run. Under these circumstances, I think perhaps an evolutionary process and a step-by-step approach may lead to better outcomes than the ones we had so far. With these thoughts in mind, I would like to express my very best wishes for the success of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas, for your opening remarks. Now, in my capacity as the director of the office of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, so I'm also a very proud member of the Department of the University here, Politics and Governance, I would like to welcome you. Be it diplomats, be it representative of the various religious groups in Cyprus, and I'm very happy to see at least clearly one visible member of the religious groups in Cyprus. I hope there are others here who might not have recognized it. So a warm welcome, and a warm welcome to you all. For a number of reasons, is what I believe really a timely conference. Timely conference is the standard phrase organizers use when they introduce their conference, but for reasons I'll outline in a second, I think this is a really timely one. I want to start on a personal note. When I really came to Cyprus, I came on an excursion in 1992, but I'm a German living in Cyprus basically since 1995. And one of the privileges I had back then when I came, because I came with my car, with my German number plate, is that I could cross to the north, when Greek Cypriots couldn't. And one of the first things I noticed was the destruction and plundering of the churches and the very sorrow state of the cemeteries in the north, which I always thought was a disgrace and one of the darkest chapters in modern Cypriot history. Gladly, any Turkish Cypriot I spoke to shares this perception. So, to make it clear, the record of Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot community as being responsible for the destruction of the cultural heritage in the north is a worse one than that of the Greek Cypriots, who are not clean either. Yeah, but in the north, it's a story of systematic destruction. In the south, it's largely, but not completely, a story of neglect. But both religious sites on both sides, the graveyards in particular, for me, were an obvious field to work on reconciliation. Respect for the dead is something that exceeds cultures and religion and should be a win-win for everybody. So for years I was placing the idea and playing with the idea, shouldn't that be a confidence-building measure, maybe young people from both sides of the divide clean up the cemeteries of the other community and all the rest of it. And nothing came out of it until about more than 2 years ago. Thorsten Kruse approached me, who's an old friend of mine, and said he has this project going on, investing in the religious sites and the cemeteries on both sides of the divide. And I got very excited, as this project was very dear to me for the reasons I outlined to you. And I immediately offered support, and we decided to organize a conference last year in Münster with the Institute, the Interdisciplinary Institute for Cypriot Studies, on exactly this topic, when the cemetery becomes political. We were interested not just in Cyprus, which will be a heavy focus here, but what happens to religious sites in ethnic conflicts, of which Cyprus is one prominent example featured here. We had what I believe is a fantastic conference, and therefore I know that this one is going to be fantastic because some, or many, but not all of the papers are the same that were held a year ago. So we changed venue, and we changed audience, and we changed some of the speakers. During that conference, I learned there are actually efforts going on to do something about it. We had a paper that will not be given at this conference by a Greek Cypriot scholar who talked about the efforts of the Greek Cypriot community after the opening of the Green Lines to restore some of their cemeteries. And the help they found by the Turks and Turkish Cypriots who were living in that village to restore that cemetery. So there's something going on. I come back to the word timely. And now the issue of restoring cemeteries is hot on the agenda for a number of reasons. It's not just this conference. The Greek-Turkish Forum has suggested to restore the cemeteries, and all the German embassies involved in the project that might have to do, including Cypriots in restoring cemeteries. We will be in the need for confidence-building measure, or, Andreas is going to love me for this, a gradual approach to improve relationships between both communities, given that I'm very pessimistic about the prospects of a solution of the Cyprus problem in the foreseeable future. So we have to shift and see what else can be done in the absence of a solution, or even if there's one, even better, then also the question of the religious sites will become a prominent one. So I very much look forward to today's conference that will tell us a lot about the cemeteries and their fate and the religious sites in Cyprus, but also that of the region, and to conclude with some technical remarks. Be careful, we film the event, if you don't want to be filmed or you make a contribution, you don't want to be in the videos we will issue on our website and the websites of our partners, so you can see the lectures and others who can't attend can see the lectures, then please tell us, and we will cut you out. This is perfectly legitimate, you have a right to privacy, but I believe the interest of the general public and of you maybe to see some of the lectures again you might miss or you might want to hear again is something we want to offer to the people here. Last but not least, talking about the Ebert Foundation, a German NGO working in Cyprus, amongst other things also for reconciliation between both communities. If you think this event is fantastic, and we're one of the co-organizers, and you think, maybe they do other fantastic stuff, there's a way to find out. And there's also a way to keep up to date with the developments on both sides of the divide in a relatively descriptive way, because we issue a newsletter, a monthly newsletter in German, less relevant for you, but also in English, which at the end has the upcoming events. So it's for free, that's the good news. You get it electronically, that's the even better news. The only thing you have to do is to sign up at the reception. There's a list in case you're interested, and if you think this is crap and I don't want to see that again, just send us another email and we will not bother you any longer. Last but not least, there are two entrances here, but the Germans could only catch anybody coming from the right to register as participants in the course, which helps us immensely when we have coffee later on. So please, if you haven't registered, just give us your name and then sign up for the newsletter in the process. So, with that, I wish all of us what I know is going to be a fantastic conference, and I offer the platform to Sabine.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm now the last one to welcome you here. I think most have been said. I'm representing the Institute for Interdisciplinary Cypriot Studies, which is the co-organizer of this conference, and with regard to this institute, let me briefly mention that it was founded at the University of Münster in Germany in 1996, I'm always bad with numbers, as a kind of joint venture between the Cyprus Ministry of Education and Culture and the University in Münster, and I'm very pleased to have in this audience Andros Nikolaidis at these crucial times when the institute was founded. He was the ambassador, the Cypriot ambassador, at that time still in Bonn. Later on the embassy moved to Berlin, and he has always been a very close friend of our institute, and it's really nice to have you here. For those of you who want to know more about our institute, I have brought some flyers. They are laid out in the beginning, where you also have to sign the registration forms. And I also invite you to visit the website of our institute. It's mentioned on that flyer too. And just very, very briefly, with approximately 45,000 students and more than 120 subjects, the University of Münster is one of the biggest in Germany. And with our institute, it houses a really unique institution, not only in Germany, not only in Europe, but even worldwide. And I could tell you much more about this institute, but I don't intend to give a lengthy welcome speech here. The previous speakers, Professor Theophanous from the University of Nicosia, and Hubert Faustmann, also from the same university, but also the director of the Cyprus office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, the FES. They have, in principle, said all that should be said at the beginning of such a conference, and I can also only welcome you once again. I would like to express my gratitude to the speakers that they have come here to participate very actively in this conference, and also I would like to thank you, the audience, for the interest in this event. It has already been said that we had a parallel conference in Münster almost exactly at the same date last year in March, and that we changed a little bit about the speakers. 4 of the speakers who had already attended the conference in Münster are here too, and we also wanted to add some new aspects to this conference here in Nicosia. So there are also other speakers now active in this conference here. And I would also like to tell you that we plan to publish both conferences, the one in Münster and the one here in Nicosia. This will be published in the series of publications of our Cyprus Institute at Münster, which I and Thorsten Kruse, he has already been mentioned before by Hubert Faustmann, are representing here. I would also, like to mention that, to stress once again, that Thorsten Kruse, who will afterwards also give a paper here, present a paper here, he's really the driving force behind this conference. This means the one in Münster and the one here in Nicosia. Hubert has already mentioned that he has started in 2015 a research project with the objective to investigate the way the religious heritage is dealt with in the divided island of Cyprus. A project, the importance of which I do not have to mention here or emphasize here especially. It turned out that with Hubert Faustmann and the FES, we had found the perfect partner with whom we could realize the first conference in Münster and with whom we can now realize this conference here. A big thank goes to the FES, to you, Howard, to Christine, who is outside sitting, and to the volunteer workers in the FES, and it goes of course also to the University of Nicosia, who is housing us here. We can hold this conference in their premises. So let's now start with the conference. Let's hear what the speakers coming from Cyprus, from Greece, from Germany and from Switzerland can tell us about the political dimension. A cemetery or other religiously connotative places can gain under certain circumstances, especially in countries with multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. And since such societies are a widespread phenomenon, this conference on the cemetery, which becomes political, is dealing with a topic of enormous importance, not only in Cyprus. And so, Hubert, I think it's now you who is starting the first panel, yeah? Okay.
Thank you. I must admit that I'm very glad to be here today, both in my capacity as a writer on the topic of religious cultural heritage, as well as a lawyer. And by the way, it was another writer who famously said that there is a difference between a good lawyer and a great lawyer. The good lawyer knows what the law says, but the great lawyer knows who the judge is. Well, today, of course, I'm only going to talk about what the law says. But to be honest, talking about the law may turn sometimes into a rather boring monologue. So, in order to avoid that, I thought of addressing only 3 basic questions in the hope that they will serve as a useful introduction to a subject rather difficult in many respects. So, first question. When we are referring to the religious cultural heritage of this island, what do we mean from a legal point of view? Second, what's the connection between the legal status and the international status quo of this heritage? And last but not least, what are the legal prospects for this particular heritage, taking also into consideration of its unique spiritual value, which is directly linked, as we shall see, to the fundamental human right to religious freedom. So, to begin with, as the title of my presentation already implies, in legal terms, there is no substantial difference between the concept of cultural heritage, or religious cultural heritage for that matter, and that of cultural property. Both notions have been frequently used under various definitions and quite similar criteria in a great number of international legal instruments concerning culture. However, notwithstanding the various definitions provided by international law, what is deemed worthy of preservation and safekeeping as a cultural asset in the first place is primarily a matter of national selection. In other words, it is a matter of domestic legislation. Here in Cyprus, for example, where the first comprehensive legislation on cultural property was introduced back in the early days of the 20th century by the British Crown, we now have a modern, consolidated version of all the colonial provisions relating to the protection of cultural heritage under the so-called Chapter 31 of the laws, also known as the Antiquities Law of Cyprus. Without going into much detail, obviously, the law uses a quite broad language in order to encompass all religious works that possess a certain artistic, historic, or archaeological value, and have been either listed as protected monuments within its annexes or have been declared as such by the state. As an effect, within the scope of the law falls indeed a great number of significant religious sites as well as a variety of religious objects. And in all these cases, no person shall make any alterations, additions, or even repairs unless this is expressly permitted by the competent Department of Antiquities. It should be noted, however, that even after a religious asset has been classified as a protected heritage asset, it can be still used by worshippers for religious purposes, and rightly so, since the freedom of religious communities to designate sacred objects and sacred sites is one of the basic aspects of religious liberty. A liberty which is in fact stipulated by the very constitution of the Republic of Cyprus, in conjunction, of course, with the relevant provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights. And it goes without saying that this applies to all religious groups located on this island and not just to the constitutionally recognized ones, meaning the Greek Orthodox Church, the Muslim community, the Armenians, the Maronites, and the Roman Catholics. Of course, in terms of domestic legislation, one should also take into consideration the relevant legal acts of the European Union, which have been incorporated into national legislation, as well as the various international legally binding instruments which have been ratified by Cyprus, like the 1972 UNESCO World Heritage Convention, which has been designed in order to ensure the identification and safekeeping of religious sites of outstanding universal value, such as the painted churches in the Troodos region here, or another more recent UNESCO convention regarding the intangible cultural heritage, which has obviously broadened the scope of protection. So, with all this insight in mind, it could be argued that what constitutes the religious cultural heritage of this island, in broad lines of course, and always from a legal point of view, is the great variety of elements, whether tangible or intangible, rooted in the religious traditions of Cyprus, that form part of the unique cultural property which has been deemed worthy of protection and preservation by law. So, in light of this rather general definition, we may now cast our attention to the second question. What is the nexus between the legal status of this particular heritage and its current situation? Well, to begin with, I think that in order to establish the legal status of a divided property, one must first identify the parts into which this very property has been divided. Obviously, in our case, there are three major groups of heritage assets that have been formulated de facto since the catastrophic events of 1971. First, the group of elements located within the government-controlled part of the island. Second, those assets that have been located in the northern part. And third, those assets that have been spread all over the world through an elaborate crime network of illicit trafficking. According to this unfortunate separation into three parts, the first group obviously falls within the scope of the aforementioned legislation enacted by the Republic of Cyprus. The second group, however, is located within a territory that is considered to be occupied. And according to the definitions provided by international law, a territory is considered to be occupied when it comes under the effective control of foreign armed forces without the consent of the domestic government. This is, of course, a factual determination, and the reasons or motives that led to the occupation are irrelevant. So, once a territory comes under the effective control of a foreign army, the laws on occupation are applicable, and the occupying power must respect human rights law, and among other obligations, must take measures in order to preserve cultural heritage and avoid by all means the destruction of any private or public property, including, of course, religious institutions and monuments, unless military operations make it absolutely necessary. It should be noted that on the basis of this effective control approach, the European Court of Human Rights has found Turkey responsible for the deprivation of occupied private property in the northern part of the island. However, the same court, quite recently, and quite unfortunately, I might add, has dismissed a similar case made by the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church of Cyprus. The Archbishop argued before the court that a great many ecclesiastical properties in the north had been destroyed, vandalized, looted, or stripped of their religious function, yet the court dismissed the case for procedural reasons. And thus, as the saying goes, being on the right side does not always guarantee justice. Anyway, according to the relevant legal instruments, and by that I mean primarily the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, as well as its subsequent protocols, the protection of occupied religious sites is among the priorities of international humanitarian law. Nevertheless, as it has been attested by various official reports, the extent of the destruction and pillage of religious heritage assets in the northern part of the island is unimaginable. In fact, this systematic destruction and desecration of religious sites has been even characterized as a cultural genocide. And to be honest, this allegation seems to be in line with the wording of the first drafts as well as the spirit of the 1948 Genocide Convention. Legally speaking, however, this perspective counts for little, since the cultural dimension of the crime of genocide was not included in the final version of the Genocide Convention. Besides, as far as the International Court of Justice is concerned, the War Court, as it is also called, has never explicitly addressed the issue of cultural heritage protection, whereas in relation to the International Criminal Court, which is a different judicial institution that has produced significant case law regarding the protection of religious heritage, Turkey is not even a party, and therefore there is an obvious lack of jurisdiction relating to criminal prosecution for offences committed against the occupied Cypriot religious inheritance. So, all in all, there is an actual absence of international judicial enforcement mechanisms capable of ensuring compliance with the relevant international rules regarding the protection of occupied religious heritage in the north. That being said, it remains that the gravest threat to Cypriot religious inheritance has been the pillage and theft committed by individuals, which are private, civilian actors not bound in this regard by the national rules and regulations. And as far as the Republic of Cyprus is concerned, the domestic legislation has been effectively harmonized with the relevant international and EU laws relating to the illicit trafficking of cultural objects. Besides, the Republic has already entered into bilateral agreements, most importantly with China, Israel, Russia, Switzerland, and the United States regarding import restrictions on religious artifacts. In relation to the ongoing looting in the north, however, the Orthodox Church of Cyprus has been modestly successful in repatriating over the years a few yet valuable religious objects, either through diplomatic channels or through legal action, as in the infamous case of the Kanakaria mosaics back in the early 90s, when a federal court in Indianapolis ruled that an American art dealer had to return possession of certain stolen Byzantine mosaics to their rightful owner, who was obviously the church, the plaintiff church. Yet, as it is self-evident, the magnitude of the looting in the north makes pursuing every case abroad absolutely prohibitive, taking into consideration the legal costs involved, the possible duration of litigation, as well as the uncertain outcome. And the uncertainty factor here is even amplified due to the fact that in terms of private international law, we are not always sure which actual substantive law is going to be applied by the court. For example, in the aforementioned case of the Kanakaria mosaics, the judge had to decide between applying the Swiss law, since the legal transaction took place in Geneva, the Cypriot law, as the law of the country of origin, or the law of the state of Indiana, which was proven in the end to be the most relevant to the case. But leaving aside the complexities of private international law, one thing is certain in the legal world, and that's the fundamental human right to religious freedom. In fact, that particular human right is also the key to answering the last question regarding the prospects of the heritage we are discussing. We cannot talk about safeguarding, preserving, or enhancing any religious site whatsoever without talking seriously about religious freedom. We cannot talk about the preservation of historical churches, mosques, synagogues, or cemeteries without discussing about the restrictions imposed on religious communities regarding performance of ceremonies or access in general. According to the relevant case law of the European Court of Human Rights, any relevant preemptive action taken by the authorities has to be justified. And in order to determine if such interference with the right to manifest one's religion is indeed justified, the court has said that the restriction must respect the principle of proportionality. In other words, it must take into consideration and actually strike a balance between the religious demands of the interested parties, the public safety, as well as the preservation of the original character of the specific religious site in question. Besides, the further easing of restrictions on access to neglected sacred places is important not only to the fundamental human right to religious freedom, but also to the preservation of the actual physical condition of any such site. Otherwise, as we are aware of, emptiness leads to ruin. This is precisely the case for Cypriot religious heritage, which has suffered over a long period of time, apart from its spatial, geographical division, from an internal, structural separation from the vital element of functionality and free usage by the respective religious communities. I've read somewhere, and this is my closing point, I've read that this island seems like a large floating museum. In my view, as far as the religious heritage is concerned, talking in terms of just preserving certain museum pieces is not enough. This is a living heritage we are talking about. A heritage that conveys, expresses, and sustains the faith, history, and identity of the various religious communities of this island. Therefore, also in view of the legal framework in place, the broadest access to this heritage should be supported and promoted by all sides in order to facilitate cultural understanding among the peoples of Cyprus. I do hope that our discussion today will serve as a promising step forward in the right direction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hubert, for the introduction. Just preparing the PowerPoint presentation for us.
Thanks.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, in 2015 I started a project titled Religion and Politics, dealing with cemeteries, places of worship, and religious memorial places in Cyprus. This subject merits closer inspection. For the sake of this project, I have been on the islands for several times to document the status of cemeteries and places of worship of the, so to say, others, on either side of the divide. My focus was on the condition of Greek Cypriot cemeteries and churches in the north of the island, and vice versa on Turkish cemeteries, Turkish Cypriot cemeteries and churches, mosques in the south. In this short paper, I shall concentrate upon a number of the special reports between 1975 and 2012 prepared by major international organizations as to the conditions of the religious heritage in the occupied part of the island. Sadly, it was obvious that immediately after the Turkish invasion in summer 1974, nearly all Greek cemeteries became objects of wanton destructions, and many churches and monasteries of the Christian religious communities were looted and desecrated. The result of these destructive activities is still visible today. Therefore, I was rightly surprised when reading some Turkish and Turkish Cypriot sources claiming and citing that international experts had throughout the years confirmed in their special reports the major efforts of the Turkish Cypriot side at protecting the religious heritage of the so-called others in the occupied area. Keeping this assertion in mind, I started in a first step to analyze how the special rapporteurs had assessed the condition of the Christian religious heritage in the occupied area and the efforts to protect and to preserve this heritage. A further analysis on the special rapporteur's assessment regarding the Greek Cypriot efforts on the protection and preservation of the religious heritage of the Turkish Cypriots in the south will follow. Covering the whole period from 1974 to the present, this lecture will focus on the UNESCO report by Jacques Dalibard of 1976, the so-called Van der Werf report by the Council of Europe of 1989, and the so-called Bielefeld report of 2012 initiated by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Immediately after the occupation of the northern part of Cyprus, it was difficult to find reliable sources reporting condition in that area. UNESCO in 1975 appointed the Canadian expert Jacques Dalibard as advisor for the cultural heritage of Cyprus and assigned him to go to Cyprus and to report on the condition of the cultural and religious heritage. Dalibard was aware of the situation in Cyprus and the problems that might occur. In an interview in 1975, he stated that both sides had tried to exert a certain influence regarding his examinations. But he pointed out that more serious problems occurred in the occupied area itself. He stated that it was very difficult for him to verify Greek claims concerning the destruction of cultural religious heritage because he was under permanent control of the Turkish army. In some cases, Turkish commanders denied him freedom of movement in the occupied area and excluded from sites he had been given permission to inspect previously. After several visits to Cyprus, Dalibard prepared a draft report of far more than 50 pages in which he concluded that both sides were responsible for their share of cultural property destruction. But he also stressed the major destructions and problems he experienced in the occupied part. UNESCO officials, however, did not accept Dalibard's reports in the author's wording, but undertook to edit the text. A striking example is the revision of Dalibard's report written after his visit in spring 1975. Dalibard's original text on page 11 reads as follows. We have this on the slide top left. I don't know if it's readable. I will cite it. Mr. Chadash was the so-called director of the Department of Antiquities and Museums in the occupied part, had only visited a few sites of the major sites, and he had none of the information that Mr. Kayogis had given Mr. Dalibard. It also seemed that his movements within the Turkish-controlled part of the island were limited, that he had no budget, no facilities, and no staff. In addition, it was obvious that Turkish Cypriot expertise in the fields of museology, conservation of objects, and restoration architecture was non-existent. It remained for the Conseiller to assess the amount of work to be done and the means necessary to undertake it, as well as to help Mr. Jadash to set up some kind of organization, at least at the level of surveillance, to stop looting and destruction. The handwritten changes by UNESCO officers show significant aberration changes from the original on the slide bottom right. The passages where Dalibat directly or indirectly criticized the Turkish as well as the Turkish Cypriot side have been changed to such an extent that all that is left is but a mild critique or non-judgmental statements. A more delicate matter of fact is that Dalibat's assessment of still ongoing lootings and destruction of cultural heritage in the occupied area was completely deleted and replaced by a simple reference regarding the need for safeguarding cultural heritage. As you see in the last passage on the slide, namely to ensure the safeguarding of cultural property. At the beginning of 1976, UNESCO published a trivial report of only 9 pages on the status of the cultural heritage in Cyprus, naming Dalibat as its author. In this report, only some problems concerning the protection of cultural heritage on both sides of the Dalab divide were discussed. And even this paper, with its paltry results, was marked for internal use only, not for general distribution. After publication, Dalibat blamed UNESCO that they had modified his findings to suit political purposes. In a written record he later stated, quote, "Without consulting me, using my material, UNESCO published an official report, whitewashing the Turks, and this was the end of my mission," quote end. In this connection, it is interesting to mention that the cover sheet of the heavily altered report contains the remark, "The views expressed are these of the author and not necessarily those of UNESCO." So, taking everything together, it was obvious that UNESCO had tried not to become involved in political affairs, although they were fully aware of the very critical situation regarding the preservation of the rich cultural and religious heritage of Cyprus. After Dalibat's mission, no action was taken by UNESCO. This was heavily criticized by Gemenos van der Werf, who had visited Cyprus in 1989 to prepare a report on the cultural heritage in Cyprus on behalf of the Committee on Cultural and Education of the Council of Europe. In his final report, van der Werf came to the conclusion that despite all existing difficulties, UNESCO was neither able to publish the Dalibat report nor to send permanent observers to the islands. UNESCO had also not acted to prevent the sale of illegally exported works of Cypriot art, although there had been possibilities to intervene. And more important than van der Werf's UNESCO critique are his findings regarding the condition of the cultural heritage in 1989. In his report, he tried to be as objective as possible. He said to avoid any statement that could be misinterpreted in the aftermath, a plan that was quite successful, was not quite successful, as we will see. Van der Werf and his accompanying consultant expert, Robin Cormack, had only a very small time window to examine the situation in Cyprus. On their working visit, they spent approximately 2.5 days in the area controlled by the government of the Republic of Cyprus and 3 days in the occupied area, where they followed the program organized by the so-called authorities. In general, the report indicates that there was wanton destruction of cultural heritage on both sides, but most of the damage was sustained by Greek Orthodox religious sites in the occupied area, mostly as a result of looting. How sensitive the wording of such official reports could be can be verified by a passage where van der Werf mentioned the complete destruction of the main mosque in Paphos in 1964, and shortly thereafter he mentioned that they had not seen a destroyed church during their trip in the occupied part. Here we have this, the left side, the original text from the report. To combine these two statements in this form was a rather unfortunate choice by van der Werf. Although the report presented more or less an impartial picture of the situation on both sides, the Turkish Cypriot researcher Atun in 2007 reduced the report to these two statements that van der Werf's presentation proves that on one side the Greek Cypriots destroyed the Muslim heritage, while the report on the other side showed that there were no destroyed churches. Atun's interpretation deserves a critical review. Regarding the Paphos Mosque, Atun is not mentioning, as van der Werf did, that the Turkish side used the minaret as a machine gun nest and that the mosque was destroyed during the intercommunal fighting, while it was used as a military installation. At the moment, it is difficult to understand why the mosque was not rebuilt and why there is no public information in form of a memorial plaque of the mosque's former existence. With a view to the Greek churches, one should keep in mind that van der Werf had a so-called guided tour and that the destruction and desecration of Greek Orthodox churches in the north did not aim at the building itself, but on special parts of the churches like the interior or the crosses on the bell towers. However, it is convincing difference between a single incident in the three areas and the systematic looting and destruction of the occupied part that was recorded in van der Werf's report. In summary, it is obvious that the final report of van der Werf tried to be as diplomatically as possible. At no point a specific group or institution was held responsible. The conclusion of Robin Cormack showed a realistic picture of the condition of the cultural heritage in the occupied area in 1989. He came to the assessment that there had been serious losses in the north and that from the art historical point of view, informed priority now should be to prevent further theft and at least ensure the survival of that what remains. My final example today is the United Nations Human Rights Council report of 2012, prepared by the German historian and theologian Heiner Bielefeld. Right at the beginning of his findings, he stressed that questions of archaeology and of the preservation of cultural heritage were generally seen through the lens of the Cyprus conflict and hence could become highly politicized. So Bielefeld was fully aware of the situation in Cyprus. For his inquiries, he stayed about 8 days in Cyprus. In the section on Christian minorities and their heritage in the northern part, Bielefeld described the situation very frankly. Inter alia, he mentioned that he visited several derelict churches, some of which were sadly misused by the village youth for sporting purposes, such as football games. Others have been turned into mosques, community halls, or youth centers, or used for storage. He also pointed out that some churches had obviously been exposed to vandalism and looting, and that he had seen Greek Orthodox cemeteries where many crosses and tombstones had been overturned and broken. He also stated that the bad condition of the religious places is not limited to the Greek Cypriot community, but also affects the Maronite and the Armenian communities. In his final recommendations, Bielefeld inter alia called on the so-called authorities to instruct the police to refrain from activities like videotaping or filming believers visiting religious sites for worship, in particular members of Christian or other minorities. Furthermore, he demanded to revise the existing restrictions in the occupied part regarding the accessibility of religious buildings, sites, or cemeteries. Additionally, allegation of vandalism of religious sites and cemeteries in the northern part should be investigated diligently to help creating a relationship of mutual trust between the two communities. So, the Bielefeld report was one of the first reports by any recognized international organization that clearly described the conditions of the cultural heritage of Christian minorities in the northern part of Cyprus without undue consideration of sensitivity of the parties concerned. And his recommendations were for the first time directly addressed to certain institutions. Bielefeld also frankly criticized, albeit at a much lower level, the shortcomings and obstacles relating to religious freedom of the Islamic minorities in the Republic of Cyprus, and made their specific recommendations. Although all rapporteurs delineated the desolate state of the religious heritage of the Christian communities in the occupied part in a more or less clear manner, and although all of them demanded urgent measures, nearly none of these suggestions were implemented due to the political situation. Since the fact that over the years there were so many initiatives and studies by all these well-renowned organizations, it must have been obvious that there was an urgent need for action since the events of 1974. Since we see that there are possibilities to play an active part in this endeavor, I just want to name the successful restoration work of the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage. The question which therefore arises whether insistent initiatives, for example by UNESCO or the Council of Europe, at an earlier stage could have created a substantial change of the situation of the religious heritage on both sides of the divide. So far, my brief report trying to present a case of twofold bias making it difficult to attain true information, and bias in distorting its public presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Marina, and we are going to be presenting together with Kemal here a project that is very dear, or still it was and still is very dear to our heart, the Cypress project. I have to say I am really impressed by Torsten's determination to have us at this conference and take time off our busy schedules and busy lives. It was a good introduction to the University of Münster Center, which I am very happy to have learned about. We are here as said already by Hubert in our former capacity as UNDP employees. UNDP, the Bicommunal Development Program of UNDP, was a program supported by the United States Agency for International Development. The program was operated under different phases, starting from 1974 and finishing in December of 2015. And the Cypress project was one specific project from 2003 until 2005. The Cypress project aimed to provide an opportunity for Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots to rehabilitate cemeteries that had been inaccessible to them for many years. The project developed an inventory of all Greek Cypriot cemeteries in the north and Turkish Cypriot cemeteries in the south, using a range of information sources, including official records and site visits. It also engaged members of the public in the project and set up a telephone line through which members of both communities could call to provide information about sites and take part in an interactive questionnaire designed to capture living memories. The team supported the restoration of 5 cemeteries, 2 Greek Cypriot cemeteries in the northern part and 2 Turkish Cypriot cemeteries in the southern part, as well as the Armenian cemetery in Ayia Sophia. The scope of the work included the restoration and rebuilding of external walls of the cemeteries and the main entrance of the cemeteries, as well as a general cleanup of the area. Relatives were invited to visit, plant cypress trees, and contribute to the rehabilitation of the tombstones of their loved ones. Individual tombstones or private tombstones were not touched by the project itself. As I said, this was a project that was supported by USAID under the Bicommunal Development Program. The Bicommunal Development Program was comprised of a number of projects, which included cultural heritage preservation, but also supporting the capacity building of civil society, helping to foster collaboration and cooperation among experts, as well as civil society members. There was a Turkish Cypriot and a Greek Cypriot steering committee at the time that were selecting the projects that were operated on. And now, going a little bit deeper as to why or how the Cypress project came about. After April 23rd, 2003, the decision to open the checkpoints basically hundreds and thousands of Cypriots started to cross to the other side for the first time in many years. Since the division of the island, contacts and crossings between both parts were almost non-existent. However, the memories about the times before the divide were still very much alive among the older generations. Younger generations, on the other hand, grew up listening to stories from their older relatives. When the crossings started, thousands of Cypriots piled up at the checkpoints to see the other side. The former neighborhoods of the displaced communities, and particularly the houses where people used to live for decades, churches, mosques, and cemeteries became the center of attraction. The idea for a project on cemeteries came up upon these developments. After 30 years of isolation, the Greek Cypriot cemeteries in the northern part of the island and the Turkish Cypriot cemeteries in the southern part of the island were generally in a very bad condition. As a Greek Cypriot, I am, ashamed to say at, those visits that we did, I saw equally bad conditions on both sides. So with the initiation of the international community and with full support from the leaders of both communities, the project had a kickstart at the height of the Cyprus negotiations within the framework of the Anand Plan, while the excitement of the crossings was still very much alive. Initially, a cemeteries advisory group was proposed. The group would be consisted of the church, FCAF, representatives from both communities, as well as a secretariat for the project. The secretariat of the project would be made up of a Greek Cypriot, that is Stavroula Georgiadou, a Turkish Cypriot, Kemal, and they would be assisting the cemeteries advisory group. As it was mentioned, the idea of a cemeteries advisory group came up at a period when there were historical developments on the island. The expectations for a Cyprus settlement were very high. There were frequent contacts between the leaders of both communities, whereas the international mediators were playing a very vital role. However, already known political and bureaucratic problems and fears prevented the establishment of such a joint initiative as a separate institution. Instead, the Secretariat, which was established at the Bicommunal Development Program at UNDP's premises, took an active role in executing the project. Relevant institutions, including the Church, associations of displaced people, and FCAF, were informed and consulted whenever actions were needed. The first mission of the Cypress Tree Project Secretariat was to create the most updated database on the Greek Cypriot cemeteries in the northern part of the island and the Turkish Cypriot cemeteries in the southern part of the island. A detailed information form was created, allowing the Secretariat to enter detailed information about each and every visited cemetery. The form included sections about the size, condition, previous information, and visiting dates, as well as observations and notes to allow the Secretariat to enter specific information when needed. The Secretariat also, I have to say, took pictures of the cemeteries in electronic format. Just to come to the findings of this two-year project, on a more technical side, after 30 years, the Greek Cypriot cemeteries in the northern part of the island and the Turkish Cypriot cemeteries in the southern part were in obviously very bad condition. During our visits, we discovered that individual tombs as well as other parts of the cemeteries were demolished, destroyed, or eroded due to different reasons. Time itself had been a main source of erosion on the cemeteries. Since they were not taken care of by their respective communities, the cemeteries were left to the mercy of time. In addition to the passing of time, the weather conditions had a negative effect on the integrity of those places. Many cemeteries had also been vandalized by people, especially during the early years of division. Over the years, such cemeteries were either isolated and left abandoned or abused for different reasons. While some cemeteries were used as a dumping area, few were turned into animal farms, barns, stables, particularly in certain villages in the northern part of the island. In one village, the tombs were cleared out from the cemetery and the area was used to plant vegetables. Depending on how old the cemetery was, certain cemeteries disappeared over time and the area was used for a wide variety of reasons, including building homes, parks, parking lots, etc. This is the case for some very old Turkish cemeteries as well, which left their traces in the files of FCAF as well as certain old inhabitants of their respective areas. And I think some of you know about the very ancient Ottoman cemeteries in Limassol that are not in a very good condition.
I love Marina when she starts, you cannot stop her, she's correct.
Sorry.
I think it was a very good summary. I think it is important to remember when this project was initiated, that was the first time the crossing started. And before the crossings, there were decades where people were fed up with stories and nurtured with fears and concerns. And so there was a time when they were about to face the reality. And what they saw in the other side, some of them were justified, their fears, and some. I think in the heart of this project, what we were trying to do is to put the human in the heart of things. Because as the title explains, the cemetery is becoming political, and the title, if you read it again in this conference, political used in a very negative way. Because it means that you are trying to use something humanitarian, something belongs to the cultures and the peoples and the communities, to justify your political positions. And you can try to justify your political positions, but at the end of the day, the human is in the heart of everything. And this should be remembered. This was the aim of this project as well. The other finding of this project was the fact that most of the population movements of the Turkish Cypriots were taken in the 60s, and the Greek Cypriots in 1974. And you can understand the economic differences of the decade in Cyprus was actually a determining factor. People were poorer right after the independence, and people were way richer after economically more prosperous after the division, at the time of the division. So you could imagine when the Turkish Cypriot cemeteries were left, we were talking about a poorer segment of the society in 1960s. And historically, we know that the Turkish Cypriots are even more poorer than the Cypriots, so it makes it trouble. Therefore, most of the cemeteries left in the southern part of the island were they were not able to buy tombstones. They were putting wood or a piece of stone as a sign of cemetery. And in the next 10 years, when we go and visit them, actually makes them even less visible. So the amount of distraction, if you like, was not really as striking as it was in the north, because we were talking about the cemeteries in 1974 when people were actually starting building things, and the tombstones, which are made of cement and which are very visible. And when the act of hatred and when vandalization takes place in the north, in that as a reciprocity, it was more visible and more understandable, because it is not easy to destroy a cemetery in the north as easy as it was when there was a piece of stone. And so this was another sign of our demographics and the sociology of the time. The other finding I would like to mention is the fact that when we were trying to invite people to take part in this project, it is one more interesting to see the reflection of the official narratives in the both sides. After 74 and until today, then Zehno, don't forget, is the official narrative in the Greek Cypriot community, which means that, don't forget, it was always, I remember when I was a kid, we were watching the Greek Cypriot television, there were signs of pictures of the villages left in the north, and they were saying no. So it is always very important to address the cemeteries, the religious sites, as a sign of ownership and a sign of not forget. So it was important in the Greek Cypriot community not to forget what happened, what had in the north. In the north, however, it was like a fresh beginning. The official narrative after 74 was a restart. We are restarting a new country for ourselves, and our country is not Cyprus. Therefore, it is very important. It was a part of a picture where whatever left from before 74 for the Turkish Cypriots in the south, what should be, it is nostalgic. It's past. So, we didn't, as Turkish Cypriots, talk a lot about, that's how I felt at least when I was growing up, that we also have our home in the southern part of that. So, when we were inviting the people to take part, it was a very emotional and a very sensitive and also very legal thing for the Greek Cypriot communities and the communities which were established, the displaced villages, to take part in this, and they were very, very organized. And some of my personal observations is that some Turkish Cypriots were not as willing to spend their daily, to break their daily routine and go and visit. And you have to remember there is also 10 years generation difference. So we are not talking about your immediate loved ones for Turkish Cypriots, but mainly your grandparents or great-grandparents. And so it was okay to go and visit, but after a couple of visits, it wasn't really taking us okay. So I think we could not manage to create a momentum in that particular project for 2 years so that the masses start interacting. Another finding was that when we were doing pilot projects in a specific village, let's say that you went to a former mixed village in the north. We go and we tell them we are doing pilot projects on both parts of the island, and our intention is to bring people together, make them actually as a sign of apology, if you like. But when you go to a specific village, you say that I'm doing this particular cemetery in the currently Turkish Cypriot village. We are going to fix the Greek Cypriot cemetery. They say, why aren't you fixing our cemetery as well in our village? Say, look, it's a Turkish cemetery in the Turkish Cypriot village, so it's not within our scope. The immediate reaction, of course, was that, the internationals are again spending money to fix the Greek Cypriot cemetery, and we are living in a not in a good condition. So reciprocity was not immediate when you were doing the pilot project. But so I don't want to go on. I'll give some time for you to ask questions and we can discuss it. I think it was a very dear project for us. Elizabeth Cassinis is here. She was working at the donors at the time, and then she remembers it in case as well. It was ups and downs in the sense that we were trying to bring the two institutions together in the upper level, and unfortunately that didn't happen as we desired. And at one specific case, I was kindly asked not to enter the premises of the particular institution because I'm a church. So, these are the sensitive times, and this is another sign how the existing humanitarian issues are being used for specific agendas. And I think the message of the day for me is that we have a long way to go to apologize and look back in an objective way.
Just to finish on what Kemal said, I think one of the biggest lessons learned is that paying tribute to the dead and respecting cemeteries and places of work is a big chapter in the Cyprus peace-building agenda. And a chapter that unfortunately has yet to be tackled adequately, I feel. So I do hope it's, there's going to be brave people that are willing to tackle it, take it on. Thank you.
So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me. I was also part of the participants of the regional conference in Münster, so it's good to see many good friends from the time again today, and hopefully it's going to be a very productive seminar like the previous one. I know I'm talking after lunch, so I have to compete with your digestion system. So although it's a very dark and sad subject I'm going to discuss, and sometimes morbid, as we discussed about cemeteries and death, I still hope it will be interesting enough to keep your attention and to have a very interesting exchange after my presentation. For more than 20 centuries, Thessaloniki had been home to a vibrant Jewish community. The first Jews may have arrived from Alexandria around 140 BC. The ancient Jewish community of Thessaloniki constituted a typical example of a Judaic community in a Mediterranean urban center of the Hellenistic and Roman eras. It is in the city synagogue that Apostle Paul came to preach the new religion, as you know, the letters to the Thessalonians in the New Testament. Following the Spanish Inquisition in 1942, thousands of fleeing Jews found a home in Thessaloniki, creating a large and flourishing Jewish community, one of the most prominent in the world. These Jews were called Sephardim and kept to our days the old Castilian idiom which they were speaking, known as Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. When the Greek army entered the city in 1912, the Jewish community constituted the majority of the inhabitants, some 80,000 people out of the population of 150,000. During the Second World War, more than 90% of the city's 50,000 Jews were transported and murdered in the Auschwitz death camp. In December 1942, 3 months before the deportations of the Jews of Thessaloniki began, a rare event in the history of Nazi-occupied Europe took place: the destruction of the vast and ancient Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki. The Nazis lacked a consistent policy regarding Jewish cemeteries. As Carla Hess and Thomas Laqueur point out, quote, "In general, the Nazis did not systematically direct their fury against bones and monuments. All of Europe's major Jewish cemeteries, except for that of Thessaloniki, survived the Holocaust more or less intact. This includes those in the very heart of National Socialism," end quote. The same can be said for all other Jewish cemeteries in Greece that survived the war. The old Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki was probably the largest Jewish necropolis in Europe, numbering nearly 500,000 graves and covering an area of 350,000 square meters, a powerful symbol of the centuries-old Jewish presence in the city. Initially outside of the city walls, the cemetery became a central location as the city expanded eastwards. Its vast area gradually inhibited local transportation, and residents would complain that it attracted illegal and immoral activities in the late hours. And this new reality put the position of the cemetery in jeopardy. As Maria Vasilikou wrote, quote, "The Jewish cemetery had been threatened long before the murderous police of the Nazi troops reached the Thessalonica Jews and their cultural heritage," end quote. Following the big fire of 1917, the city was almost completely destroyed. French urban planner Ernest Ebrard prepared the first plan for the rebuilding of the burned area, which was approved in March 1919. Ebrard used the latest practices in urban planning, which dictated that cemeteries should be removed from within the city limits. He envisioned the area of the main campus of the University of Thessaloniki and the park, removing thus the cemetery from the city blueprint. The issue became a cause of friction between the Greek authorities and the 50,000-strong Jewish community in a city of 250,000 residents. But using religious, historical, and political arguments, the Jewish community managed to delay the decision. In 1937, a law gave part of the cemetery land to the university, while the rest of the area would be turned into a park, where the existing tombs would remain untouched. Burials in the old cemetery would be prohibited after 1 year. Although a part was indeed given to the university, burials on the remaining land continued and a park was never created. This is a little bit the chronology. I'm going to start by speaking about the Liberty Square events in 11 of July 1942, and then until the 6th of December 1942, which is the destruction of the Jewish cemetery. Here you see in the map, in the outlined area, this is the old city of Thessaloniki. On the right, you see the area of the university, which is the former land of the cemetery. Here are some old pictures of the cemetery in the late Ottoman, early Greek period of the city. This is the building in the background is the first building of the University of Thessaloniki, which was an old Ottoman school, an Ottoman military school. again, here you see Jewish cemeteries written in old maps of the city. Here again, the same cimetière in French. Again, on the right, you see a Jewish cemetery. Here's the building of Thessaloniki, the university, and in the background you see the cemetery. So, the first mass anti-Semitic measure when the German army occupied Thessaloniki in April 1941 was the compulsory assembly in Liberty Square of all Jewish males on Saturday, July 11, 1942, to be mobilized for forced labor. The Black Sabbath, as it became known, saw approximately 8,500 Jewish men, aged 18 to 45, going through humiliating gymnastic exercises under a blistering sun. German soldiers beat those unlucky Jews who arrived late, smoked, or dared to sit down. The purpose for forcibly drafting such a labor force was mainly for construction work overseen by the Todt organization. The following weeks, until the end of August 1942, some 3,500 Jewish men were drafted and sent to different parts of Greece to build roads, railways, and airports, and work in mines. And this is a picture from these works. Most of these men had never been employed in heavy construction, and they were far from qualified. Under a harsh regime of harsh labor and limited food and hygiene, many suffered. When the first bodies returned to Thessaloniki, it caused an outrage in the Jewish community. The population demanded that its leadership improve the working and living conditions of the laborers. As the winter was approaching, efforts were made to negotiate the release of the laborers by paying a ransom. The Jewish community had agreed to the amount of 2 billion drachmas. However, the German officer in charge of civilian affairs, Max Merten, approved the 2 billion in cash, but added a new stipulation, the destruction of the old Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki, the land of which he valued at 1.5 billion drachmas. Merten's new demand caught the Jewish community leaders off guard and left them with little move to maneuver. The demand for the cemetery, in addition to the ransom for the release of the Jewish laborers, further complicated the discussion. Merten must have been informed that in Jewish tradition, a cemetery can never be removed. Nevertheless, he saw no signs of compromise, and the Jewish leaders were left with no choice but to succumb to the German blackmail. Despite the ongoing but slow negotiations, eventually the destruction process of the vast Jewish necropolis did begin on December 6, 1942, marked by a meeting of Merten with the Greek and Jewish community officials on the cemetery grounds. 500 workers were reportedly tasked by the municipality, with the city spending around 100 million drachmas for the destruction of the graves and the gathering of the materials in piles. Jewish eyewitnesses noted the remarkable speed and zeal with which the workers took to their task. Quote, "It's obvious from such a hasty manner that the excessive enthusiasm shown by the Greek authorities that it was not just the springs of the beautification of the city that motivated the authorities to quickly demolish the Jewish monuments. Greek archaeologists were present to catalogue the few tombstones with Greek or Latin inscriptions. In just a couple of weeks, wrote an eyewitness, Rabbi Molcho, the vast necropolis, scattered with fragments of stone and rubble, resembled the city that had been bombed or destroyed by a volcanic eruption." End quote. Local Jews raced to save the remains of their loved ones as the workers were destroying the cemetery. Based on interviews with Jewish refugees who arrived in Istanbul, in Constantinople, U.S. Consul Burton Berry reported back to Washington, quote, "Workers set about dismantling the tombs and disintegrating the dead. The work of destroying the cemetery was done in such haste that very few Jews succeeded in finding the remains of their families and relatives. Recently buried dead were thrown to the dogs." End quote. These are pictures from the destruction of the cemetery taken by the Red Cross at the fairly early stages. This is pictures taken by German soldiers also after the destruction. These are post-war photographs taken after the end of the war. A few weeks after the destruction of the cemetery, the Jews of Thessaloniki were forced into ghettos, and from there they were transported to the Nazi death camp in Auschwitz, in German-occupied Poland. The cemetery grounds became, in effect, a huge quarry. The Germans, the church, the city, associations, theatres, and many others used the marble stones and the bricks as construction materials. A modern visitor to Thessaloniki can still see stones with Hebrew inscriptions in parks and churchyards. Rabbi Morfo described what happened to the materials, quote, "The memorial stones remained piled up, mixed up, in the old necropolis. They are at the disposal of the first passerby. The marble merchants enriched their stock, delete the inscriptions, and use the marble in various ways. Churchills pave their courtyards with them. They are used to adorn and to repair the nearby houses. Some schools lay the courtyards without even caring to erase the visible signs that betray the origin. The Nazis take them to construct a swimming pool, and the whole city is full of them, and the price of marble falls in the market. After the war, the plunder continues, and the venerable cemetery is transformed into a huge marble quarry from where all the buildings are supplied. The municipality of Thessaloniki requested 100,000 bricks from the demolished Jewish cemetery. It did so before the supplies exhausted, so they could be collected for needs that might arise. The Ioannidis school received 50,000 bricks and 100 square meters of marble to construct toilets for the use of children using the soup kitchen. The sailing club also requested bricks and marble from the cemetery, and it was approved by the municipality. The State Theatre also asked for marble from the Germans, and its entrance was laid with marble from the cemetery. The Christian cemetery of Ayia Sophia also received marbles, also for its church, for a small temple, for interior elements, the iconostasis, the floor, the wall claddings, for the fence, the buildings, the courtyards, etc. Researcher Vasilis Ritsalleos counted 17 such requests out of 70 churches in Thessaloniki from January 1643 to October 1843. The medical school of Thessaloniki also took stones. Tombstones were used as dissecting tables for the anatomy course. They also constructed 3 big pits with thick cement where they would bring and place the bodies from the destroyed cemetery in order to be used for the training of the students. So these are pictures that you see, stones used in the front of homes. This is the pool that I mentioned, constructed by the Germans. This is British soldiers inspecting the pool after the end of the war. Again, this is the British officers checking the German military installations after the war. This is assembled tombstones and people who create them, who prepare them for sale, to be sold as materials for construction. This is in downtown Thessaloniki, piles. These are in front of the White Tower, they are selling them, as you can see. In front of the Ayia Sophia church, again outside of a church in Thessaloniki. This in front of the St. Demetrius Cathedral, I'm going to speak about it as well. Many actors were involved in the plunder of the cemetery: the state, the municipality, the church, local associations, businessmen, with complex relations, competing roles, and not aided by the lack of a clear hierarchy. The Germans kept the overall control, while several Greek government agencies were involved with the practical arrangements. Due to its vast size and number of graves, as well as the limited means at the time, the destruction of the cemetery was not completed during the war, and it continued after liberation. In fact, most of the heavy digging took place after the war, as the new university buildings were being constructed. The land dug from the old cemetery area was used for the enlargement of the seafront of Thessaloniki. The Jewish community complained to no avail, arguing that the land contained the physical remains of the Jews of Thessaloniki buried in this area. The Jewish community, as well as foreign organizations, made a request to the Greek authorities with limited success. Nowhere did we find any moral considerations around this issue. In July 1946, a Jewish delegation to Thessaloniki, which included Dr. Cecil Roth, reader of Jewish Studies at Oxford University, quote, saw carts in the cemetery removing Hebrew tombstones on the instructions of the Director of Antiquities for the province, end quote, and visited the church of St. Demetrius to witness the reparation works with the use of the said tombstones. The St. Demetrius Basilica is built on the grave of the patron saint of Thessaloniki. They contacted Stylianos Pelekanidis, the curator of Byzantine antiquities for northern Greece, and the main person responsible for the church's restoration, which was burned in the big fire of 1917. Pelekanidis only saw the holy and positive sides of his actions. The utilization of the marble, quote, for such a holy piece of work as the reconstruction of the St. Demetrius Church, has even a positive action when considering that the stones of the Jewish cemetery have been used for all sorts of purposes, even for pavements and toilets, end quote. He also blamed the Jews for not indicating to his service the tombstones of historical value prior to the deportations, and offered additional legalistic excuses, arguing that the Jewish community had no property deeds. According to another report, Pelekanidis expressed amazement at Jewish protest against the use of the stones in the church. He claimed that some of the stones, those with Greek and Roman inscriptions, had originally been stolen from Christian graves, although this constituted a very small percentage compared to the total number of tombstones. According to two French researchers, Claire Zaltz and Tal Brutman, quote, local authorities used the German presence to implement their project. One could thus speak of the opportunity effect of anti-Semitic policy, which made it possible to disregard the protest of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki in order to raise and obliterate the graves. And let me conclude briefly. Hope I'm okay with time. The destruction of the Jewish necropolis of Thessaloniki was not just an event in a linear sequence of Nazi anti-Semitic measures in the city. It was not directly linked to the so-called final solution, and coincided with the deportations of the Jews that were put in motion a few weeks later. During this time, the main initiators were the resident German officers, with the contribution of local Greek Christians against the local Jews, without any instructions or involvement from Berlin. The destruction of the cemetery tested the relations between the German military authorities, the Greek authorities, and the Jewish community on the eve of deportations. Hess and Laqueur concluded, quote, the story of the destruction of the Jewish cemetery from the landscape of modern Thessaloniki lies in the temporal convergence of three narratives: that of the Holocaust, that of modernization and a shift in the places of dead away from the living, and finally that of the Greek national integration. Nowhere else, in no other great city, did the imperatives of modernity and of nation building telescope so decisively with the crisis of occupation and genocide. End quote. The presence of the Germans' accelerated developments had been in motion for decades, but hidden below the surface. They were the enablers, the catalysts. It is clear that they were responding to a local demand, willing to accommodate certain wishes of the local Greek Christian population and its leaders, and they took it upon themselves to oversee the cemetery destruction process. They had the main role in all of the events, issuing the orders, chairing the meetings, and even regulating the location of tombstones. In a certain way, the extensive use of the tombstones of the destroyed cemetery by all sectors of Thessaloniki society, including the church, gave this action a sense of legitimacy and invited every ordinary citizen to participate. It legitimized the anti-Jewish actions and solidified the clientelar relations between the Germans and the Greek authorities. Yale professor Timothy Snyder observed that, quote, such a major property transfer of the land of the cemetery generate a sense of material complicity between the Germans and locals, as well as a new moral barrier between the non-Jewish Greeks and Greek Jews. End quote. The whole operation was also full of symbolism, that the sign of Thessaloniki's future, the university, that would educate the future generations of Greeks, would be built on the land which hosted the generations' old remains and historical monument of the other, of the people who were there before. And let me continue with some photographs in the PowerPoint. This is from the reconstruction of the St. Demetrius Cathedral that I mentioned. And this is the cathedral with the tombstones lined up outside. Again, from the same monument. You can still see stones today with Hebrew letters. These are this is excavations that are happening as the cemetery was being destroyed. This is an interesting picture. These are, after the war, they would go on school trips to the cemetery. And this is a picture from school students who were there on a day trip with their school, and they found skulls and bones, and they took a picture as if it's normal. In fact, the woman who gave me the picture is a professor at the University of Thessaloniki. She says at the time it was normal. Once she sees the picture today, she's freaking out. But at the time it was it wasn't anything. This is another trip of a school to the destroyed Jewish cemetery. These are stones that are found outside of different Christian churches, more or less like exhibition after the war.
It's a crime that is heavily punished. So the point is that anything, any demand for example, the Lebanese war ended, but 17,000 Lebanese are still missing. I mean, 17,000, there is nothing known about the fate of 17,000 Lebanese. So if there is a kind of an NGO or talks about what should we do, and this is a major problem for a large number of families, what should be done about that? When such NGOs become loud enough or try to lobby the parliament, they would immediately be threatened by that law, by that item of the law that they are actually provoking sectarian tension. So by digging graves, literally, by digging old graves. So one should not dig old graves. By the way, there are a number of mass graves in Lebanon. Some were in 1982 after the Israeli invasion. Others were actually in 1976. 1976, 1982, and in 1989, 1990. So there are phases, and it is known where they are and when they happened for four major huge burial places, and these are not investigated, and one should not investigate them. I mean, it should not become political according to the Lebanese law. So, I mean, such a conference would be illegal in Lebanon, so try not to think about it. Now here, as I said, this is a mosque in downtown Beirut, and the building of the municipality of Beirut in downtown. It shows the physical scars of the Lebanese civil war, and this is immediately after the end of the civil war. Now, surprise, surprise, this is how it looks like, and this is how it should look like now. The mosque, this one is this one there on the top. And here we have the Saint Elias. No, this is Saint George Orthodox Church, and next to it is the Sayyidat Nuriye Santa Lucia. This is Greek Catholic Church in downtown Beirut. And as you can see, this kind of a huge wasteland and destruction and so on was transformed to this. And by actually, this project is quite controversial because part of it was done by public money, and those who were reluctant were actually their property was confiscated and given to a development company to do that. So this is actually this is the synagogue of Beirut after the Lebanese civil war, the interior, where it was still, I mean, not in a very bad shape. Actually, interestingly enough, during the Lebanese civil war, it was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, protected the synagogue and did not allow refugees to come and occupy it. I mean, because for them it was important. It was kind of asking for legitimacy and so on. And now that is the synagogue, and its current in its current over-restored situation. I mean, it looks more like a candy cake. It's quite, especially the colors. Anyhow, now this is as I said, one should remove the scars of the civil war and create something like this. I mean, we create with much celebration and self-congratulation, like, look at the Lebanon, I mean. But actually what is hidden under the carpet is the large problems that were not discussed earlier. So I'm reminded that I have maybe to go quicker. So I spoke about the mass graves earlier. I'm going to speak about the danger to cemeteries currently. Now this is an Armenian cemetery in Byblos. And we have the graves, and actually there's a plan of building a beach club there. So actually, these graves should be removed.
And this is a Muslim cemetery in Beirut. It doesn't look like one actually, with a new hotel built next to it and encroaching on it. So the Muslim Foundation had to put this sign saying that this is the cemetery of Santiya, you know, but actually it is nothing. It's simply these kind of flowers that are growing. This is the Greek Orthodox cemetery of St. Nicholas, and we have all these beautiful old marble graves from the 19th century. Some were made in Italy. But as you can see there, for expansion works, they are building on top of the graves. And there you can see the cement actually, so the graves are not anymore exposed. Well, not this one, but there. They are going in the foundation of new buildings. So the problem of desecrating cemeteries is a problem of space nowadays. It is each community almost desecrating its own graves. And here, you know, like another thing which is peculiar to Lebanon, I would say, is that the mosques or the places of worships were relatively small. And I was shocked. I mean, this is the Omari Mosque of Beirut. It is much smaller than the Omariya Mosque of Nicosia. And that was the other mosque which we saw earlier, but this is before the Civil War. This is after reconstruction, a relatively modest building. I mean, Beirut was not known for its large religious buildings, but it was never a capital, by the way, in the Ottoman period. I mean, unlike Nicosia, so it was a provincial city. But here we see the small buildings. I mean, they are not larger than the surrounding buildings. And here we see the new thing. This is the new mosque built in the downtown area. A very large mosque. You will see it from a different perspective, next to the St. George Church of the Maronite St. George Church, actually wall to wall. And this was considered, actually, this mosque was considered as an offense to the Maronite community. Shame on them. I mean, you know, they built a huge mosque with such high minarets. I mean, this shouldn't happen. So that's what happens. The church decides to build a bell tower, which is actually higher than the minarets. And there we see, from a different perspective, the minarets and the new belfry or the new bell tower, which is almost as high, or actually it is 1 meter higher. But the Lebanese are very proud actually of this, because they think, or that's the official Lebanese image, you know, like this is coexistence, al-aish al-mushtarak, as they call it in Arabic. We live together, you see, you know, like, but I mean, yes, we live together, but we compete in the height. I mean, you know, so I don't know where will we reach in the end. Anyhow, this is a kitschy night photo of these two monuments. But please look at these two monuments in their urban context of Beirut. So the competition to go in the height had to compete with the capital, actually, which is going in the height. I mean, you know, like, it is permissible in some areas in Beirut to build buildings of 45 stories high, and so on. So it is the religious communities now are trying to kind of prove or show some presence. You know, we have to compete with others. And here is another back to the same photo. Try to see if you can find the Anglican church. It is there. It is dwarfed. And so this is why there is the need to go like that. I mean, you know, like, we have to have our presence. But also this says something else about the Lebanese political system, because there are no real interreligious political parties. So each community is not only a religious community, but also a political community. There are no interreligious political parties, or if very few. So this is why the competition of this kind in this urban presence. Now, maybe one hope for the future
This is the plans of a museum for Beirut. Actually, Beirut has the National Museum and so on, but it doesn't have its own museum. So there will be a museum for Beirut, in Beirut itself, with a tower most probably higher than the mosque and the church. And it should actually have not only exhibitions about archaeological findings, but also documenting the Lebanese civil war. Now, I don't know if that will pass according to the law of igniting sectarian tension or something like that. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Well, I will start the presentation with an incident described to me by a taxi driver a few years ago that made me really curious about this St. Barnabas Icon Museum, and that's how I started this research about this museum. One sunny day, a Greek Cypriot taxi driver drove a group of tourists to the location of the St. Barnabas monastery in the northern part of Cyprus. The tourists were interested in visiting an icon museum located inside the disused monastery. When they arrived at the location, they paid the €3 entrance fee and entered the monastery. Once inside the icon museum, the tourists started examining the icons and reading the labels, which clearly marked the depicted saints' names and the icon's dates of creation in Turkish and English. On the other hand, the taxi driver, who was admitted for free since he was escorting the tourists, made the sign of the cross and started kissing the icons in the iconostasis. When he finished, he turned around and was surprised to see the group of tourists staring at him. An uncomfortable silence prevailed. No one said or did anything. Interestingly, two different conflicting modes, a museum mode and a church mode, was adopted by two different groups of visitors. The Greek Orthodox Christian taxi driver, entering what he perceived to be primarily a church proper with religious icons, proceeded to the natural act of paying respect to St. Barnabas and the other saints, and thus adopted a church mode. The tourists, entering what they perceived to be primarily a museum with artifacts of historical importance, adopted a museum mode. The guard, perhaps uncomfortable with the alternative use of the museum, but also aware of the political and religious complexity which surrounds the space, seemed to be tolerant of the man's religious expression. The northern, mainly Muslim part of Cyprus currently runs 4 icon museums that focus on Byzantine iconography. This is rather perplexing considering that both communities of the island consistently highlight the cultural heritage that best fits their perceived ethno-national sense of identity. This presentation attempts to explore the politics surrounding the creation and use of icon museums in the northern part of the island and investigates the way a minority group of visitors, the Orthodox Christian group called the Women of St. Barnabas, perceive and use one of these icon museums. The St. Barnabas Church and Monastery was built in 1756. It's one of the most sacred sites for Greek Cypriots, was operational until 1976, and it reopened as a museum by the Turkish Cypriot authorities in 1991. The St. Barnabas Icon Museum is not unique as a space that used simultaneously as a museum and a religious site. Cathedrals and other religious spaces turned into museums often adopt dual identities. However, the St. Barnabas Icon Museum is an interesting case for 2 main reasons. First, the museum itself is entangled in politics and cultural conflicts. It's claimed by 2 communities, the Turkish Cypriot community that turned the church into a museum, and the Greek Cypriot community that claims that the space is still a church and that the Turkish Cypriot authorities use it illegally. Second, the Women of St. Barnabas refuse to acknowledge the site as a museum, pay an entrance fee, or use the museum as a secular space, and therefore resist the museum's institutional power. This specific case study raises some important questions regarding the relation between museums, exhibiting sacred objects, visitors, and politics. How does the overall political environment in which a museum functions shape institutional and individual power struggles? Is a visitor's religious background adequate to explain responses to religious artifacts? What is the role of politics in influencing how museums are used? There are three factors that influence how we look at sacred objects in museums. The first one is the museum context. An object's physical setting and the way it is displayed can determine to an extent its identification as an artwork or a religious item, and therefore its interpretation. In the St. Barnabas Icon Museum, there seems to be a struggle between keeping the space as a monument while making clear that this monument is not really in use. Visitors. Visitors' motivations, goals, interests, expectations, attitudes, opinions, and lifestyles have been shown to influence museum visiting and uses. When it comes to sacred objects, it is assumed that a visitor's religious orientation and beliefs play an important role in the way he or she perceives and connects with them. The women of St. Barnabas who have strong religious feelings and specific political beliefs appreciate the space and its contents in a different way from the one suggested by the museum. Furthermore, they are able to enact meanings and interpretations different from those of visitors who do not share these beliefs, such as foreign tourists or non-Christian visitors. Politics. Neither museums nor their visitors function in a political vacuum. The decisions of museum professionals and visitors are often influenced by external political forces they cannot control or ignore. As we will see, the creation and functions of the St. Barnabas Icon Museum are highly affected by politics, while the persistence of the women of St. Barnabas in using the space as a church instead of a museum is consciously or unconsciously informed by the same politics. We argue that there is a complex network of understandings combining institutional and individual perspectives, which are sometimes conflicting, but which are nevertheless shaped by the same political debates. To understand the complex political environment that the St. Barnabas Icon Museum operates in, we need to understand the relevant politics and cultural wars currently taking place in Cyprus in relation to our case study museum. To do that, we examined a variety of publications and films in English, since all sites usually publish in both Greek or Turkish and English, to address an international audience. As Hardy notes, each site has produced a number of official and semi-official books, articles and websites that avoided or excluded inconvenient data in order to be able to write politically convenient histories. Since they tend to exclude information that is key to understanding but disadvantageous to them, most official publications are considered somewhat biased. Nevertheless, these reports are useful for our purposes because they outline the claims made by the two communities regarding ownership, cultural destruction, and icon museums. These claims are outlined in this table. Since the intercommunal conflicts between Greek and Turkish Cypriots in the early 60s and the eventual events in 1974, political as well as cultural wars have been taking place in the local and international arena. For example, the Greek Cypriot authorities publicize as much as possible the cultural destruction of religious sites and the lack of religious rights in the northern part of Cyprus. At the same time, the Turkish authorities publicize that religious sites are not only neglected and destroyed in the northern part, but also in the southern part of Cyprus. Mosques and other Islamic religious sites, such as cemeteries, have been reported to have been either vandalized or demolished. Furthermore, it is stated that the neglect for Christian sites is largely due to a lack of international assistance and limited resources. In the early 90s, the Turkish Cypriot authorities established 5 icon museums, now there are 4, in the northern part of the island. In the spirit of the Cypriot political and cultural wars, these museums seem to take different forms, reflecting the nationalist claims of the two communities. For the Greek Cypriot authorities, they are seen as a proof of the purposeful and continuous cultural destruction of Christian religious sites, as propaganda tools, or as spaces who are temporarily out of order due to the Turkish occupation, which will resume their normal function as soon as a solution is found. Contrarily, for the Turkish Cypriot authorities, icon museums are the answer to Greek Cypriot accusations of cultural destruction and a public display of the respect and religious tolerance. As a result, depending on the individual's ethnicity, these museums are often seen as either temporary, emotional institutions or permanent, neutral ones. After examining the politics surrounding icon museums, we decided to use St. Barnabas Icon Museum as a case study. We observed the behavior of about 350 visitors and conducted interviews with 8 members of the group called the Women of St. Barnabas. Observation on the site showed that St. Barnabas Icon Museum is mainly used by tourist groups, led by local guides who reside either in the northern or southern parts of the island. All of the tourist groups we observed, regardless of their country of origin, appear to adopt a museum mode. That is, they use the space as a museum. Activities such as guided tours, photography, and souvenir buying at a nearby store took place. On the other hand, it was obvious during observation and throughout all the interviews with Greek Cypriot women that they do not perceive St. Barnabas as a museum, but primarily as a church. Alexia echoes the opinion of most of the interviewees when she states, quote, "I can never see a church as a museum. A church is a holy space. It's been sanctified. It cannot function as anything else. It cannot be anything else." End of quotes. However, all the interviewees are aware that the space functions as a museum. And some even consider this a fortunate event because its current use contributes to its preservation. The very first act of resistance, which is also a symbolic one, is the refusal to pay the museum's €3 entrance fee. The data analysis from the interviews revealed that 3 interconnected reasons for resisting the institutional power of the museum and using the space as a church. The first one, the space and icons are holy objects and should be treated with respect. All the interviewees seem to feel that religious spaces and objects cannot be turned into secular ones because they maintain the grace of God. It was clear during both observation and interviews that the icons are used by this group as religious artifacts that aid prayer and not as items of historic or aesthetic value. Second reason, the decisions of the other, viewed as an illegal occupying force, are rejected, especially when it comes to managing the cultural heritage of Greek Cypriots. The separation between us and them, Greeks and Turks, Christians and non-Christians, was apparent in all the conversations we had with interviewees. When asked why they believe the Turkish Cypriot authorities decided to turn St. Barnabas Church into an icon museum, the main reasons offered were related to either economic benefit or propaganda. And C, there is a lack of respect and proper care of the museum. Apart from the perception that the other cannot respect the space and icons as much as they do, some interviewees argue that this lack of respect led to a lack of proper care and preservation. This perception was highlighted when interviewees compared St. Barnabas Icon Museum with Greek Cypriot icon museums. For the interviewees, the conservation problems and the way icons are presented at the St. Barnabas Icon Museum testify to the lack of respect towards Orthodox Christian beliefs and a lack of concern about the preservation of Christian art. This creates uncomfortable feelings and contributes towards the rejection of the concept of a museum space. To summarize, the women of St. Barnabas expressed 3 main interconnected reasons for adopting a church mode instead of a museum mode. The first reason has to do with the space's previous use as a church and the icon's devotional function. by claiming that the museum is still a sacred church and the icons still retain the grace of God, the interviewees employ spiritual reasons to justify why they continue to perceive the space in religious terms. However, the other two reasons that emerge from the interviews are not necessarily spiritual. The reasons they offer under the logics of ours, not theirs, and lack of respect and proper care, are more about the struggle with ownership and authority than the religious significance of the space and icons. Claims about feeling uncomfortable at the museum because it's managed by the Turkish Cypriot authorities, or that it is not clean and maintained because the Turkish Cypriot authorities do not care enough about it, aren't involved with the politics that surround the space. Thus, the decision to use the museum primarily as a church rather than a museum is not just, as the participants initially claimed, a spiritual decision, but also a political one. The political influence is also evident when the interviewees discuss their visit to other icon museums located in the southern part of the island and managed by the Church of Cyprus. The same people in different icon museums in the same country behave in dramatically different ways. In the other two icon museums mentioned by the interviewees, both in the southern part of the island, the Museum of Cyprus Monastery and the Byzantine Museum in our galleries, the interviewees adopt a museum mode in the sense that they are willing to pay an entrance fee and avoid touching the icons or lighting candles. The main reason for this erratic behavior is apparently primarily a political perception rather than a religious one. It seems that the political sentiments which are presented in official and semi-official publications of the Republic of Cyprus influence to a large degree the interviewees' perceptions and thus museum uses. The extreme case of the women of St. Barnabas presents us with an ideal example of how individual power and institutional power are both shaped by the socio-cultural and political environment in which they function. Nevertheless, it's important to mention that the power exercised by museums and visitors take very different forms. On the one hand, museums can have political, cultural, and social agendas, and thus be in a position to negotiate national and communal identities. On the other hand, individuals have personal agendas, always interrelated with their self-identity and experiences. Therefore, they have the power to shape and negotiate personal memories and meanings and to enact different identities in objects and spaces. Furthermore, the act of rejecting the institutional power of the museum by using it as a religious space instead of a museum feeds back into the socio-political environment as another argument against the destruction of Christian heritage and the limitations of religious freedoms. Here, we are presented with an active and at the same time powerful audience. Thus, we end up with a circle of power that is fed by Cyprus' political environment. To conclude, we should be aware that behind religious, historical, scientific, and even aesthetic claims may lay conscious or unconscious political perceptions that influence how museums and the objects they house are seen, used, and experienced. Thank you.
But interestingly, Ayia Sophia was also the reference point of the Muslims of Cyprus. So when they conquered the island, they found one Ayia Sophia here as well, St. Sophia Cathedral, Catholic Cathedral. They converted into a church and they kept the name Ayia Sophia until 1952. They also renamed the Nicolas Cathedral in Famagusta Little Ayia Sophia. So Ayia Sophia was always in their imagination as a positive reference and also a reference to Islamic monument in Turkey. Of course, it was a converted church as well, but the way they adapted Ayia Sophia and the way the Ayia Sophia inspired the whole mosque architecture of the Ottoman period. So when you see the Ottoman period mosques, is usually replicas or the slight changes, Ayia Sophia's products. I'm going to try to sort of use Robert Hayden's antagonistic tolerance framework to look at how religious sites competitively coexisted in the previous pre-modern period, and also during the British period, and currently, how there is a kind of competition existing in the religious scapes with the architects that they are building. So Hayden says, since religious sites are indicators of political dominance or challenges to it, we can look at the measures of dominance that have potentially universal applicability. These measures are based on what we have come to regard as important features of major religious sites. So perceptibility, especially visibility, audibility, and massiveness plays a huge role. And centrality, of course. So what do you mean by perceptibility? The visibility of the building is very important. So when you look at the cities, the main building of the religious site or the symbol of domination is right in the towns like St. Sophia Cathedral, or in Turkey, the Ayia Sophia Cathedral on the hill overlooking at the whole Constantinople, all that. And during modern times, the same thing continued. Massiveness, the sublime features of the building is very important as well. Audibility, bells, ezan in Islam. For example, loud ezan, you can dominate the soundscape very easily with that. So, what I'm trying to say here is the religious scapes can be politically used for the domination of whoever is in power. So, but what happens when someone is in power and the other, which is not part of this dominant religious group, what happens to them? So there's this tendency of tolerance, explanation of tolerance regarding Ottoman period, which is exaggerated, how Ottoman used the millet system to tolerate its minorities. Hayden uses Waltzer's negative tolerance term. Tolerance is not something positive in a sense. You tolerate. You tolerate and you draw your limits. You can have a church, but not a bell tower. You can have a mosque, but not a minaret. Or the church should not be visible as my own temple. So all these limitations are drawn in this antagonistic, tolerated environment of one religion who is in power. So what happens if that religion, any of the religions are not in power and you are in the colonial environment? There is a third element ruling the environment, and then you have these two former elements. One was the former dominant, the other one was the dominated one, and you are in this new environment that you have a third entity trying to sort of balance the situation. There is a competition, open competition. The suppressed competition comes out. So when we look at the British period, remains of the British period, as you can see here, this is Peristorana. It is the symbol of coexistence, yeah? But I will argue that it was a competitive coexistence in a sense that both bell towers and minarets were not there before British arrived. Because Ottoman period, until 1856, there was a prohibition of bell tower building. The first bell tower was built in Larnaca and Rumut villages after the second Tanzimat decree. Lazarus was the first one, and then the other places came about. Interestingly, Muslims didn't have any minarets in their churches. There was a couple of villages. If it was a Nahiye district center, you had a minaret. So the only village with a minaret was Minaret. The name was called the village with a minaret. Neohorio had an Ottoman Turkish name as well. So with this relative relaxedness of British, you had these competitive features that started appearing. When we come to the rise of nationalism, this competition turned into a more violent competition in a way. The first targeted places during the conflict was either churches or mosques in certain places. For example, Kırklar Tekke was the first target as a religious site. Then you had Hala Sultan sometime was targeted. You had the Ayluga church in 1956 was burned down. So all these other and now becoming the antagonistic other have become the targets. When we came to 74, of course, there was this huge violence, displacement, and everything. So how did both sides adapted the remains of the other after the ethnic cleansing and the population transfers? First of all, the Greek Cypriots or the Orthodox left around 500 churches in the north. And the Turks didn't know what to do first. Their refugees were coming, they were bringing settlers, and they needed mosques. So they started adapting the churches into mosques. So you have this kind of interesting architectures appearing by turning the churches or adding a minaret to a church and using it as a Muslim worship place. There were almost 67 churches converted to mosques. So the faith of the other churches, of course, was even more unfortunate. There were some cases like museums, but also a lot of the churches were used as barns, and some were used as a discotheque, some was used as a warehouse, cultural centers, and things like this. So they had different kind of usages. Some was just left there to ruin. And what happened then? Greek Cypriot refugees came to south. Interestingly, with the Christians, they don't use mosques as churches. The church has, I don't know, I mean, you know it better, different kind of functions than the Muslims. For Muslims, it could be a synagogue, it could be a church. After a conquest, you can turn it and use it, as can be seen with Ayia Sophia. The Greek Cypriots hurriedly started building these prefabrik churches. So in the Turkish Cypriot villages where they were settled. This is from Lemba, for example. The mosque was used as a cultural center, but this was a new prefabrik churches. I think 70 of them were erected for the refugees in different settlements. Some was on Turkish property, some was just a state property. So on both sides, there was a different kind of adaptation of the other's property. Then, starting from 2002, this is a bit earlier, you started to have a different kind of appearances, mosque building in the Cyprus. Until 2002, only 9 new mosques were built in the north. Only 9. This is one of them. But here, the reason why the urgency of this mosque is this is where still the Greek Cypriots live. So look at the way they built the mosque. It's on the hill, higher than the church. It's a functioning church, by the way. The minaret is higher than the Greek Cypriot thing. I saw this picture in the Vakıf office, the architect's office. He said, look, peaceful coexistence. So now we know that it's not that peaceful the way this picture came about, but for an outsider, it's usually that this beautiful picture shows a minaret and a church bell tower together as a coexistence. So Ayia Sophia, this is the imagination, the center. or attraction. Interestingly, not only on the Turkish Cypriot side with the new mosques, the churches started to resemble like Ayia Sophia in the south as well. This is actually called Ayia Sophia Church. Where's the name of the place? Strovolos, yes. It's not coincident that since the AK Party and the religious party in Turkey came to power and talking about turning the Ayia Sophia in Istanbul into a mosque again, because it's been used as a church, this I think had a kind of motivation also to remind the Ayia Sophia's church origin in that sense. This is the new mosque in North Cyprus. It's another Ayia Sophia with 4 minarets appearing. So they are actually, what goes on in Cyprus now is the Ayia Sophiaization of the landscape in that sense. So you have different sizes of the replicas of Ayia Sophia appearing everywhere. For example, this is again one of those villages that they were using the church as a mosque, but now they stopped using the church as a mosque and built this little mini Ayia Sophia there. And this is from Hala Sultan. Have you seen this church before? Behind? That's the another Ayia Sophiaization near the Salt Lake, dominating Hala Sultan, which is the most important religious site in the south. So this is Pile village. There is again a coexistence there, as you can see, and the minaret. You can see the struggle between minaret and the bell tower there as well. When you go to border, further you go to border side, bigger the churches and minarets get, or higher they get. Anyway, that was my short presentation of the Ayia Sophiaization. We can open up more with the discussion. Thank you very much.
First of all, I have to thank the institutes and also FES for inviting me here for the second time after Münster last year. I would like to talk a little bit about the Turkish Cypriot secularism and provide some facts so we know, because this is important to know what happened to the occupied part of Cyprus after 1974 in the following years, and especially during the last 10 years. First of all, the Turkish Cypriot community is believes to the Hanefi school of Sunni Islam, but it is widely acknowledged by scholars, Mete and also Ahmed and others, that the Turkish Cypriots are among the most secular Muslims in the world. So this is important, and I will explain why as we proceed. Also, it's a fact that most Turkish Cypriots rarely visit the mosques, except in funerals, do not fast very often, do not pray often, and do not follow the traditional religious ritual of Sunni Islam. The situation became, I would say, more developed during the last years as the development of modern life dissociated the community even further from religious practices. Another thing is that today very few Turkish Cypriot imams operate in the new mosques that I'm going to show in a minute. I would say also that the cultural, social, religious and language particularities of the Turkish Cypriots are not accepted that easily by mainland Turk politicians and especially Turkish government officials that consider the Turkish Cypriots as, in quotations, problematic and quotations deficient Muslims, that they need more religious education and rehabilitation, and also they indicate a suspicion about Turkish Cypriot infidelity. Just to note the facts, I would like to mention that Cypress Lee wrote in 2012 that at the time there were 192 mosques in relation to 160 schools. There was one hospital for every 62,000 people, while there was one mosque for every 1,380 people. 3 years later, Yanidu Zen wrote that at the time there were 204 mosques in the occupied areas. it's important to understand what is happening in the occupied areas as far as the Islamization of the landscape, and not only, to have a little look at the traditional Turkish Cypriot mosques and masjids before 1974. Here we see the masjids are small mosques, usually in villages, that they do not have a minaret, and I showed 3 examples from different villages, Alaminos, Gorovia, and Afania. The last 2 are in the occupied area. The first one is in the Republic area. So we have 2 types of mosques. The first one is the small mosque with minarets, and then we have the smaller mosque, masjids, without minarets. As far as the masjids is concerned, the typology usually is a small and humble rectangular roof tile building without a minaret. Usually it's single room, except in some cases that there are 2 distinct rooms side by side, where one was used as a mosque and then as a school, as a village school that was side by side. Here is a brief look at the mosques that they have a small minaret. Usually this minaret, as you see, the top left photo is from Bileri. The minaret is short and thin. This is important, as we are going to see that some of the decisions taken later by the Turkish Cypriot authorities in the occupied area are contradictory to the religious beliefs of the community. Characteristics is that usually these mosques are small buildings, modest, rectangular, single room, roof tiled again. Usually they have a front covered veranda, a portico, of pointed or curvy arches, as we see in the photograph at Ablimo Mosque. There is, as far as the dome is concerned, because the dome became an important element of Ottoman type mosques that have been spreading very fast in the occupied areas. In Cyprus, through research, I have discovered that only 4 Ottoman mosques have a dome as part of their architecture. One is the Hala Sultan Tekke, the Zuhuri Tekke in Larnaca, Arab Ahmed Mosque in Nicosia, and another one in Lapithos. So only 4 Ottoman type mosques exist in Cyprus with a dome before 1974. Now, I would want to emphasize that the typology of Turkish Cypriot mosques and masjids is a clear and strong reflection of Turkish Cypriot secularism and liberal cultural and social perceptions of the community. I also want to mention a latest report, 2017, about what the Turkish Cypriot said to the Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. They expressed concerns from Turkish Cypriots regarding the perceived efforts by Turkey to transform their culture and to Islamize their society in ways they felt did not reflect more secular and tolerant local cultural practices. The building of mosques, not in keeping with the traditions of architecture, the creation of religious schools with textbooks produced elsewhere, and attempts to make religion a mandatory subject in ordinary schools. So the Turkish Cypriots themselves, today, 2017, complain that there is an effort to Islamize their society and religious and beyond religious affairs. Now, I will try to put a logical order in this process of Islamization in the northern part of the island, which started from the period 1974 up to 1980. The first thing that happened was the cleansing of the occupied area through the de-Christianization and the de-Hellenization of the area. And we have different steps. First of all, it was the physical removal, expulsion of the Greek Cypriot population, the destruction of all Greek language signs, the desecration, looting, destruction of more than 550 Greek Orthodox churches, monasteries, and chapels, and almost all Greek Cypriot cemeteries. There is no question that the level of destruction has been rather systemic. It's impossible now to emphasize who is responsible, but I just want to make a comment that even in mixed villages where there were both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, we see that the Turkish Cypriots did not protect the churches or the cemeteries of the Greek Cypriots. So there is a question of responsibility there, at least as far as the mixed villages concerned. The aim of the process was the complete erasure of the Greek Cypriot and Christian Orthodox identity from the occupied areas. Unfortunately, this is the bitter truth. I have to also make a comment that remarkably, all these Byzantine period treasures, icons, and religious artifacts from the Byzantine area, from the Byzantine era, survived the Ottoman occupation, but they did not survive the Turkish invasion of 1974. This is a really interesting point. The second phase after the cleansing of the occupied area was Turkification, which means with the transfer of Turkish Cypriot population from the south part of the island to the occupied part of the island, the importation of mainland settlers, demographic engineering, we don't need to say more, the substitution of and renaming of old Greek names with Turkish names. And the third part that really became the foundation for further Islamizing the northern part of the island was the Islamization of Christian Orthodox churches, and we have more than 80 examples of the process. I'm not going to refer, I just have 2 photographs on the right. Now, the first new mosques in the occupied area appeared between 1982 and 1994. I have recorded 7 new mosques as they appear on the map. The first mosque was made in 1982 and it was financed by the King of Saudi Arabia, as the sign outside the mosque says. Also through the years, and also today, if you go to mosque, you find Qurans in all languages that they are published by the Ministry of Islamic Affairs of Saudi Arabia. So here we see that during this period we have a connection, a Saudi connection as far as the occupied area regarding the building of mosques. Importantly, these 7 mosques were made in secondary locations. So we have one in Morpho, one in Nicosia, but peculiarly, Kerinia and Famagusta, 2 big urban spaces, were not used to build new mosques. And we see that there is a horizontal relation starting from Podamos Campu, which is a small village on the west of the island, up to Risogarpaso, which is the top eastern village. So there is a horizontal relation that my interpretation is that it was intended to project the Islamic presence on the occupied space rather than actual satisfaction of religious needs. Here are 3 different mosques of that type, and we see that although the mosques have the Ottoman characteristics, at the same time they have Saudi elements. And I have emphasized here 3 such elements. First of all, there are covered side verandas. This is not found in any Ottoman-type mosques in Turkey or in Cyprus. There are patterned glass motifs, as you see in the 3 top photographs. And also there is Arabic ornamentation internally. So these were the first building of new mosques in the occupied area. Now, during this period, we have something else that Mete showed before. Here we see the Risogarpaso church, and he very correctly pinpointed that the mosque on top is built higher. But the interesting thing here is the proximity. And I think I have seen through my field research the proximity issue repeating itself in different phases of mosque building. Now, in this case, we see Risogarpaso village. It's a village that is quite spread in a big distance, in a big area. But you see, the Turkish Cypriot authorities decided to build the new mosque only 42 meters from the church. Okay? I give an explanation. The same here happened with another mosque at the period. This is in Kythrea, and you see the distance on the left-hand side. It's 34 meters, although Kythrea, as you see on the right side, there is plenty of space to build a mosque anywhere. Now, because I have seen this repeatedly happening in different phases of Islamizing the occupied landscape, I arrived at the conclusion that the process is not coincidental, but is rather intentional. To me, it's an indicator of visual, aesthetic, and conceptual in contextual comparison between the two religious paradigms. The superiority, domination of the new, vibrant, bright white Islamic mosques, which are new and shiny with tall minarets, with their pointed minaret over the deserted and often looted Christian Orthodox churches with their abandoned and often collapsing bell towers. For the people who had the opportunity to visit the occupied areas and see the condition of the abandoned churches after almost 45 years, you will have a better understanding of what I mean. Now, another thing that happened that has not been recognized in research is that between 1978 and 2007, we had in the occupied areas, I'm going to show a map in a few seconds, that's the refurbishment, the restoration of the masjid in villages in the occupied areas, and I have recorded more than 35 cases. I will show the map. Here is the map. In these 35 Turkish Cypriot masjids in different mosques that they didn't have a minaret, these minarets were added. Here are the dates. We have the majority during the period 1998 up to 2000, and then we have during the AKP era from 2005 to 2007. So you will see the size of the masjid, very small. Usually in Turkish Cypriot mosques that I have conducted measurements, both in the areas of the Republic as well as the occupied areas, we have minarets of a size of approximately 6 up to 9 to 10 meters. Here we have minarets that are over 20 meters high. So we see that the Turkish Cypriots decided to adopt minarets that are inconsistent to their religious beliefs. So it's interesting to mention what a Turkish Cypriot researcher said in his book Ottoman Islamic and Islamite Monuments in Cyprus, published in 2009. He said, as it rises more than twice the height of the prayer hall, its dimensions do not suit the mosque at all, nor is it keeping with the type of minaret that used to prevail in Cyprus. So we have a Turkish Cypriot acknowledgement that this is disproportionate. Now, the decision, the Turkish Cypriot, now here it's important to pinpoint that the money for the restoration of the mosque came from Turkey, but the decision was made locally. So the Turkish Cypriot decision to ignore the traditional local minaret type, which was aesthetically modest, humble and proportionate, and adopt the Ottoman-style minarets found in Turkey, that they are thin and tall, they sort of provide political connotations. First, an adherence to Turkish mainland norms rather than local Turkish Cypriot religious traditions, and then the alteration engineering of the visual and political landscape of the northern part of the island. And of course the repeated presence of the pointed minaret as a signifier of Turkish Cypriot political domination over the occupied land. So we see that quite early, even before the rise of AKP into power, we see that the Turkish Cypriot decisions were diverting significantly from the religious norms of the traditional religious norms of the Turkish Cypriot community. And this is the map that shows the locations that minarets were added. Between 1993 and 2003, we have the building of 3 new mosques, big mosques, funded by Turkey. And we see that now the selection was in Nicosia, in Kyrenia, and also Famagusta, the main urban centers. The first one was 1999, is the official mosque in Nicosia that is used also by the Turkish ambassador in Nicosia. It was funded by the Turkish embassy, and we see that it was accompanied by a complex that is the Turkish Islamic Cultural Association. So things started to become more complex as far as the use of religious buildings. And of course you see the logo of the association, this association where Cyprus is presented as green. The green is the color of the Ottoman era. Then we had the same year another mosque in Kerinia, and you see it was located in a very central location. The selection of the place was not coincidental. And again, paid by Turkey, and then this time we see that the name Nurettin Ersin Pasha Jami, it was the Lieutenant General, the commander of the invasion forces in 1974. So we see that things start to change from this time, and Turkey becomes much more involved in sort of taking, I would say, a little bit control of religious affairs in Cyprus. And of course, there was 2003, this Osman Fazil Polat Pasha Jami, of course, another lieutenant, major general that was the conqueror, in quotation marks, of Augusta in 1974. And I have put a little photograph there that is the Gandu Mosque, and you see very characteristically the minaret is short and thick. While here we have an extraordinary size of minarets that they do not relate in any way with local, traditional Turkish Cypriot mosques. So with this, we start about 2003 to see that things start to change as far as the building of mosques, which they project a significance that is more political than religious. It has religious value, but I think the political connotations and insinuations are more important. In the same period, I have identified another 3 mosques of a different type that I put here. And again, in 2 out of the 3 cases, we have similarities as far as the proximity to Greek Cypriot or Greek Orthodox churches. The first one is in Lithangomi, and the proximity to Kanakaria Church is 118 meters through Google Earth. And the second one is in Kondea, and the proximity is just 58 meters. So in both cases, we see that there is plenty of landscape, but the Turkish Cypriot authorities in the occupied area decided to sort of position the mosques very near to old, abandoned Christian Orthodox churches. In the second picture on the bottom, you can see the difference in the size of the minaret in relation to the church. Now, the last part of my presentation, which I think is the main juice as far as the political implications, that they expand far beyond the religious aspect of building mosques, of introducing mosques into Cyprus, is the systemic Islamization, not only on the occupied landscape, but also of the affairs of the Turkish Cypriot community. And I will explain. November 2002, we have the rise of the Islamic AKP into power in Turkey, and we see that until 2008 there was a consolidation of the party into power, so we don't see any major changes as far as the Islamic projects on the island. The year 2008 is actually a turning point in the sense that we see the beginning of decisive policies by the AKP government in the occupied areas in parallel fields, not just in religious affairs, but also in economy, investments, property development, as well as religious affairs and other fields. The aim was the effective strategic control of the occupied areas by Turkey. We can talk about this in another conference, so I don't want to spend more time here, but I will concentrate how the religious element of this strategy is not just isolated from other parallel policies implemented by Turkey on the island. The Islamization of the occupied areas is part of a wider Turkish strategy for domination and control of all different affairs in the occupied areas. And just to give an example, the undersea transfer and local distribution of fresh water from Turkey, the Turkish Cypriot municipalities were excluded from the distribution, the undersea cable transfer of electricity from Turkey, the privatization of Turkish Cypriot utilities that are given to Turkish mainland companies, also Turkish investment in the occupied areas, money laundering, casino, property development, and so forth. The Islamization of the occupied areas, I claim that is systemic, is not coincidental, is not accidental, is systemic. First of all, it involves the Islamization of the landscape through the massive and consistent building of new Ottoman-type mosques. Ottoman-type mosques. They are not the local traditional Turkish Cypriot mosques. So we see a religious, but in reality political engineering of the occupied landscape. And I will show examples in a minute. There is an effort to Islamize the education, and we see many complaints by the teachers, trade unions, Diktos and Theos, about the establishment of Islamic high schools and religious colleges in the occupied area, introduction of theology and religious programs in existing universities, extracurricular lessons of the Quran, and so forth. There is also an effort to Islamize the secular Turkish Cypriot religious affairs. We have purely the importation of Turkish Cypriot imams, de facto building of mosques, and many other things, and also the Islamization of social affairs. We have different events happening by the university, by municipalities, university lectures that they tend to sort of encourage the Islamization of social affairs. Now, as far as the Islamization, the actual Islamization of the occupied landscape, since 2008 until today, we have a consistent program of annual building of new Ottoman-type mosques. There are two different architectural types. We have type A, which is about 2/3, 60%, 65% of the mosques that I'm going to show in a minute, and also type B, not type A, which is about 1/3 of the new mosques. The funding, it comes completely from the Turkish embassy in Nicosia. Now, I want to emphasize that the typology is very specific. The mosques are white, bright white, tall minarets, and they are visible from a distance. My question is why they are bright white in Cyprus when most of the mosques in Turkey are not bright white? Because I have been and I have studied things in Turkey as well. We see that in Turkey the mosques are colored even with building materials, whatever. Now, the bright white is important here because one can explain that it's for financial reasons, but I don't think this is true because they could have been painted gray or some other color. But it is for political reasons, since the bright white on a mosque in the green winter or the dry summer Cyprus landscape appears from a very big distance and emphasizes its dominating presence from great distance. Here is very briefly, this is the type A mosque. There are a lot in the occupied area. This is the type B mosques with 2 minarets for 250 people. And here is the map that these new type A, type B Ottoman mosques were built in the occupied areas, lots of them. Here is some information as far as the dates. This is just for the map. And also we see some patterns in the building of these mosques, the new mosque, and the selection of the locations. In this example, we see the Melanagra village. You see here, it's a village that consists of about 10 to little houses, very little population. You see on the upper photograph that there are very few houses, but the mosque, while the Islamized church of the village is in the village, when the new mosque appeared, it was on the top of the hill. And this mosque is visible from many kilometers. Another thing that Mete showed the same photograph, this is from the village in Carpathia. We see the proximity again, while there is plenty of space, and you see the difference in the size of the minaret. And of course, the eye goes to the deserted, it was an Islamized church that it was abandoned, deteriorating exterior, and then you see the bright mosque that you cannot avoid comparing. This is, I don't know if you can see, but the minarets here, I made this photograph from 4 different locations that you can see the minarets. There is here, I don't know if you can see, there, and of course here how the minaret becomes now an important element of Cypriot landscape. And of course, this doesn't have to do with religion. This is another photograph of the Gerolakos Mosque, where you can see the difference. I have removed through Photoshop the mosque from the left photograph, and then you see on the right photograph, and it's visible from almost 4 kilometers. Now, during the last few years, 2012, 2018, I have identified through field research 6 new type of mosques that they are more close to the previous Turkish Cypriot local type of mosques. So I would say that I have identified the first one 2012 at near Gerolakos, and we have more, and the last one is being built at Gypsou, is not finished yet. 2018 is supposed to be finished. But I think the decision relates to the complaints of the Teachers Association against the Islamization of the educational system as well as the Turkish Cypriot society. This is my interpretation. I don't know if these are the actual, if this is the actual reason, but I think this is an improvement as far as perhaps the concern or the voices of concern over the Islamization. I will conclude just a second, just a minute. We have the building of 2 huge mega mosques, imperial type mosques that we see, and we see the imperial type mosque were built in Istanbul, in Constantinople, after the conquest of the city, and having the paradigm of the Ayia Sophia, and we see the blue mosque and so forth, and we see here that even for a Turkish Cypriot population that is secular, not very religious, we see that the authorities are building with money from Turkey huge complexes. This is the Hala Sultan Jami, is finished. The opening should be this year. The cost of 15 million, and here we have the another Yakin Dogu University Jami with a capacity for 10,000 people, 27 million. With this last map, I show the building of all new mosques since 1982, and with this map I would like to conclude, and thank you for your patience.